Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back in West Branch again and to see a lot of old friends and to meet some new ones. And I think perhaps most amazing of all, to actually meet a group of people who would rather hear about Herbert Hoover than watch the football game. There's something seriously wrong with you folks. Over the last couple of weeks, I put together a polished, written out statement of things I was going to say to you. Not, I think, perhaps as polished as George's was, but nevertheless, my best effort. And when I got here yesterday, I realized that wasn't really what I wanted to do, that I really wanted to be a little more informal about it and to look at it in a little different way. So I took the map that Matt Schaefer gave us to get us to the hotel, and I scribbled some notes on it. So if I'm a little less than as coherent as George was, I ask your apology. I'll do my best and try to cover what I hope to say, I think, with a little looser way. Also, before I begin, since I have, in fact, now published this book, I want to just take a moment to say publicly a couple of thanks to some people. I won't take long, but I do want to just acknowledge the great amount of help that I got from a very large number of people. The staff here at the library in particular, who welcomed me. My coming to the library goes back not quite as far as George's, but to the mid-1980s when I began coming here, and I've spent over the years a lot of time with my seat glued to the chairs out here, going through documents and looking at things. And the staff have always been wonderful about helping. They've been very, very creative. They've offered suggestions. They've been willing to talk about difficult problems with me. And then when the library closed, they've often taken me in and welcomed me, and so that we've gone and done things, and we've explored eastern Iowa together, and we've been to dinners and so on, and it made it fun. It really was a very nice part of it. It was fun doing the research, and in a different kind of way, it was fun getting to know these very, very fine people and to have time with them. I also want to say thank you to the trustees and the staff of the Hoover Library Association. They have been very generous in their financial support, but they did something which I think was also more remarkable. I had some misgivings when I signed up for this, I must admit. I thought a commissioned biography is always a bit of a chancy project. You're not quite sure what you're going to be expected to do and how close the supervision is going to be over what you do and what you find and what you conclude. And the Library Association has been marvelous. They couldn't have been better in their way of dealing with this. They were always interested, always enthusiastic, always supportive, and never, by even word or hint, suggested that there was anything that I should conclude to fit in with what they thought about Mr. Hoover. It left me totally free, and it really was, I think, perfect in that way. The third group, a couple of people I just want to say something special about. Ellis Hawley, retired now from the University of Iowa History Department, had been a wonderful support and help all the way through this. He really pioneered the modern reinterpretation of Herbert Hoover, which has become the foundation not only of my work, but of a great many other works on Herbert Hoover in the last few years. And I think his contribution to the work is really very, very important. And in addition to that, he read the whole manuscript and made a number of very constructive and helpful comments about it that have helped me make it a better book than it would have been perhaps if he had not seen it. And I'm very grateful to him for that assistance. And I think also I should say thank you especially to George Nash. George's work on the first 3 volumes of this set the standard for the rest of the biography, both in research and in clear and forceful writing. And what's more, his unfailing generosity in sharing his own knowledge of this period and of Mr. Hoover has been a beacon to me all the way through this. I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty that George Nash is probably the only person who knows more about this period that I just wrote about than I do. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that. All right, let me say a little bit about what some of the challenges of writing about this were. As George pointed out, one of the great challenges is the sheer volume of material. And when I first began the project, I got here and I began looking at the Commerce period papers, and I soon discovered that there were something like 800 archival boxes of these things filled with documents. And my resolution at the outset was to go through and look at every page. Well, I have to admit, I compromised. Sorry, George. He doesn't compromise. But I did make some compromises. I didn't look at every document. I looked at a lot. I spent a lot of months out here working on things, and I spent a fair bit of time elsewhere at Stanford and other places looking at other documents. But it's true that the sheer volume of material is really daunting, and it's very difficult to know how to deal with that. One finds very quickly that patterns do begin to emerge, and you can sort of look at those, but there's a trap in that. If you begin seeing patterns too early, you may stop seeing the documents themselves, and that's very dangerous for a biographer, because it's the document that doesn't fit the pattern, which is the one you really want to see. So the sheer amount of material is a very difficult situation. And this is one of the things that I think it's not only Herbert Hoover, but of course this is a problem for all modern biographers of people who've been living in the 20th and in the 21st century. Although now, of course, it's complicated even further by the electronic revolution, which is going to make biography a nightmare for the next generation of biographers. I'm glad I escaped that, just as I'm glad that I moved into the era where most documents were typewritten rather than handwritten. Handwritten documents are really difficult to deal with, and there are a fair number of them in the collections, but it's not as bad as it is for the 18th century, let us say, where that is the norm. So the sheer size of the material is indeed a problem. But that's not, I think, the most serious problem. I found that when I moved in looking at this period, this is a period which relatively little has been written about. The 1920s are not at the moment a fashionable era to look at, and there are quite a lot of monographs on specific aspects of it, but this is not a hot area in history at this point. So I then was, in a sense, freed to look at the period, think about it, and talk about it, and make my own views and my own interpretations of it without being shackled by the views of other historians. But of course that poses problems too. It also means that you really have to start from scratch. You have nothing, you don't have a lot of help from other historians. There may be specific kinds of things you can go and look at, but you have to learn about everything. I mean, and Mr. Hoover was in everything. So I had to learn about all kinds of things. I had to learn about aviation in the 1920s. I had to learn about the problems of the merchant marine in the 1920s. I had to learn about coal mining business. I had to learn about European economic policy. All of these things were all there. Some people had done some work on them, but nobody really put it together. And we really didn't then know. I had to start from scratch in a lot of these cases, and I was on-the-job training in many cases, because I didn't know a lot about any of the, I won't say I didn't know about any of them, I wouldn't want to admit that, but I didn't know a lot about a lot of them. And I did, in fact, spend a lot of time learning about those things and trying to understand what was going on, just to understand the nature of the problems with which he was grappling. Not necessarily trying to understand what he was doing, that was another level of problem, but to have to just understand the difficulties that he faced and had to try to find policies and issues to deal with. So that was another sort of thing. But there is, even though I say not a lot has been done about the 1920s, there is that looming thing at the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression. And to a large extent, the Great Depression shadowed and shaped the interpretation of the earlier decade. People in popular thought, and to some extent even historians, tended to read back from the 1920s, or from the 1928-32 period, to look at the decade prior to that. And it meant that since the common assumption was that Mr. Hoover had been a failure as president, the assumption was that he must have been building up to this failure, as if somehow he had chosen in 1918 to train himself to become a failure as president. That's a very unusual point of view, I would say. And it immediately was one that I didn't think was very plausible. But it is true that a lot of people looking at this are looking for the causes of failure. That was really what they were doing. And I think it was important to get that out of my mind, to not look at it that way, but to look at it as he saw it, and in fact to look at it as he later described it, as a happy period of constructive achievement. That was the way he saw that period. It was not a period building up to failure, and in fact, of course, as Dr. Janson will probably point out, he didn't see his work as president as failure. So that's another matter altogether. But it's a difficulty. And of course, then everyone adds to that, Hoover was also in the 1920s tarred by association with Warren Harding, regarded as one of the least successful of American presidents, Calvin Coolidge, more successful, but still hardly seen as a major success in the American presidency. So here was Hoover in these administrations. He must then have been mediocre at best, and perhaps a political hack, as were some of Harding's appointees. So that kind of assumption also loomed over this period, and one had to kind of work around that and think about it, understand that it was not, there's a kind of guilt by association involved here, which I think is a real pitfall for somebody trying to understand and work on this period. Then I think I concluded out of this that I didn't ultimately have to agree or disagree with Mr. Hoover. Now that may sound odd to you. I didn't go into this with any particular sense of whether he was a success or not a success. I was not an admirer. I probably shared to some extent the common assumptions about Mr. Hoover that would have been in part of my education. On the other hand, I wasn't particularly prejudiced against him, and just the least little bit of superficial investigation of his career indicated that it was remarkable in many ways, and that it was hardly the kind of career of somebody who was going to be seen as a disaster and a failure. So I then tried to sort of get around this, to clear my mind. I didn't think that I was to be writing a biography which was going to be either a unalloyed praise of Mr. Hoover, nor a hatchet job, as one gentleman wrote to Tim Walsh that he had read the subtitle of my volume and was sure that this was going to be another hatchet job on Mr. Hoover, and he wasn't going to buy the book. Well, I couldn't let that happen. So I wrote back to him and tried to assure him that it wasn't, and he wrote a nice note back to me and said, yes, he was going to buy it, so why don't you believe that?
Don't claim it's a hatchet job.
So, at any rate, what I was trying to do and what I strove for and what I think is a critical quality for a good, successful biographer, what I was striving for is a quality of empathy. That is, not necessarily sympathy. You don't have to agree with your subject at all points, but you have to have the ability to get inside his skin, to see the world as he sees it, to understand what he was trying to do, and what his successes and failures looked like from the inside. And I think that's a crucial quality that a successful biographer really needs to cultivate. It's not an altogether popular kind of idea in the outside world. We don't think, for example, that police should have empathy with criminals. But it is for a biographer, it is a very necessary quality if you're going to present the person as they really were, not as you would like them to be, but as they really were. So I emphasize that, and I think that's a crucial sort of thing in the whole biography. A third problem that I ran up against very early was something that George alluded to briefly. That is the necessity to examine Mr. Hoover's work after World War I in relief in Europe. This is an extraordinarily large topic. It is huge. There's an immense amount of material on this, and it hasn't really been dealt with fully, and it was clear to me that I couldn't really deal with it in the kind of depth it needed to be dealt with. I didn't have enough space or enough time to do that. So I, in this case, did in fact compromise, and I wrote a chapter or two dealing with that, trying to cover it as best I could and doing my understanding of it. But I didn't, I have to confess, work my way through all that material, and I didn't cover it as thoroughly as it needs to be covered. Somebody still needs to do that. I hope somebody will, but I mean, if this is an imperfect biography, that's one of its imperfections. There's no question about it. Fourth thing, which I think was a challenge. The fourth thing was in some ways the biggest problem of all. When one comes to this period of Mr. Hoover's life, to the commerce period, the commerce years, if you like, from 1921 to 28, the thing that strikes you immediately is the incredible range of activities. It was true that Mr. Hoover was, in fact, Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of almost everything else, as the cliche has it. And you start looking at this and you think, what on earth puts this all together? How does it make sense? How does one understand how to do it? And how do you present it in a way that you're not just saying, well, there's this fact, and there's this fact, and there's this fact, and the people trying to read the book just drown. Maybe they do anyway. That's for you to decide. I hope you buy the book and find out. But the point here is that it seemed to me, and I think it was clear that as one began looking at this, that in Mr. Hoover's mind, this wasn't a series of disconnected, unrelated things that were being done. They had something in common. And trying to figure out what that was one of the things that took me the longest, frankly. Maybe it was obvious, might have been obvious to someone else, but it wasn't obvious to me. And I was thinking about that, really thinking about it all the way through the project, and only gradually as I got to the point of beginning to write did it begin to fall into place. And it was really that led me to subtitle this book Imperfect Visionary, because it struck me that what did unite all of these activities of the 1920s was a kind of vision of America that Mr. Hoover brought with him into the office as he became Secretary of Commerce. What he understood, I think, was that the United States had changed in the 20 years or so that he had been away. He had been out of the country for much of the previous 20 years. He had been living in Europe, returned to live in the United States really only in 1919, and the country had really gone through an enormous change in that period. When he left, he came from a society from a background of really rural background, small town America. He had lived here in West Branch that way, he lived in Oregon that way, in a small town background, and then he had gone off to Stanford, and from Stanford he went out into the world. In the meantime, the country was changing. The small towns were merging into cities, people were leaving the farms, leaving the countryside, going into an urban society. Small shops in which individual families made things were giving way to factories and manufacturing on a large scale. It was becoming an urban industrial nation. And so the America to which he returned after World War I, and World War I, of course, gave a huge boost to that process of urbanization and industrialization. The America he returned to was not the same as the America he left in 1898. It was rather is a different place. And what is stunning to me, and what was really striking, was that when he came back, he was immediately interested. As George has pointed out, he had said as early as 1914 he wanted to take a public role, and he wanted to have some public function. But his understanding of what had happened in the United States was really less than perfect, imperfect, if I may coin a word. He came back saying that what the United States needed was reorganization of the government, and a couple of other things of that sort that bore no resemblance to the needs of America in 1919, when there were race riots and there was strikes and there were all kinds of things going on, and obviously the situation was difficult and dangerous. And he came back and was talking about reorganizing the government. Well, it didn't fly. And he very quickly realized that. Within a few months, he was beginning to talk about quite different kinds of things, and what he was beginning to talk about was a situation in which the United States was, as he recognized, becoming a consumer economy, in which sales of consumer products, automobiles, radios, and whatnot, would drive the economy, and that there were certain things that were going to be needed to make that work, to make it effective, make it functional, and above all, to bring its benefits to all Americans, not just to a small number at the top, but to all Americans. And to do that, he began talking about how do you do that? What is it that you can do that will help make this consumer revolution really lasting, stable, and valuable to all of America? And the answers to those kinds of questions, I don't want to talk you out of buying the book, so I won't summarize it, but the basic argument he was saying was what you need is you need reliable transportation, you need reliable communications, you need adequate power and energy supplies, you need to have all the kinds of information available to help businessmen plan and consciously go forward. And what he was beginning to develop was what I have called a vision of America. A vision of America where there would be an infrastructure put in place that would maintain the consumer economy effectively over the future. And that was really what he set out to do as Secretary of Commerce, was to create that structure. But he set out to do it in a way which fitted the ideology of the 1920s. That is to say, he did not say that the government should do these things. Rather, he said, I think Americans can do them themselves. What they need is information. They need to have help, assistance, guidance, and that's what he wanted the Commerce Department to do as Secretary of Commerce. He set out to create an information dispensing agency which would organize and provide private individuals, private businessmen, farmers, workers, whatever, the information they needed to plan rationally, to create the kinds of structures that would benefit and sustain this economy over the future. He emphasized the voluntary nature of that. It was crucial from his point of view that Americans should do that, and he drew upon the experiences of World War I, when, as he believed, Americans had come together voluntarily to mobilize the country for war. And he believed that those kinds of techniques, those same kinds of principles, could run the country for the 1920s. And that's the heart of what Hoover's vision was for America. And it was a very fundamental kind of conception of what the country should be doing and what the government should be doing. It's a far more active role for government than had normally been the case before World War I, but it was not a role in which the government would take over and do these kinds of things. It would be rather in which the people would do it. The government would be a catalyst for these steps, for these changes. And as I began to understand that, a lot of these other things began to fall into place, and I could see how they related to one another. Why it was important, for example, to have the railroads function effectively as a nationwide organized structure which could transport goods. Why it was important to create a network of waterways linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean on the one hand and to the Gulf of Mexico on the other. Why it was important to have a dam on the Colorado River which would generate power and control floods. Why it was important for the new industries of radio and aviation to have some sort of structure and organization, some kind of regulation under the government so that they wouldn't tear themselves apart. All of these things began to fall into place, and it became clear that they were essential components of the way Hoover saw the country's economy developing in the near future. What does this all do? Well, there's a trap in that. As I say, this is what I came to believe was what Hoover was doing. But I think there's a fundamental trap that a biographer needs to be very careful about in this kind of situation. One of the things you can't do as a biographer is tell your subject's life as it was lived. It's impossible. You have to omit enormous amounts of material. You can't deal with every time he ties his shoes. You have to think about it, and not only do you have to omit a large amount of material, you have to see some kind of pattern in it. You have to make some sense out of it. More sense maybe than it seemed to the person at the time. And that is a trap. It's a trap because if you let the pattern dominate, then you find yourself imposing on the subject of your biography a pattern that wasn't perhaps his at all. Now that kind of biography is often written, and biographers write theme books or thesis books which argue a certain pattern very strongly. Those books often make a big splash when they first come out, but I don't think they last. And they don't last because people will say, a little while later they'll say, well, I don't really see that pattern. There's a different pattern. That isn't the way it was. So rather than try to do that, I didn't want to do that. I think that was a mistake, and I don't think any of us have wanted to do that. Quite the opposite. I think what we were trying to do was to try and discern as much structure, as much organization, as much pattern as was really there, and perhaps foreground it a little bit over what it was actually in the person's mind at the time, but not create it. So that it was a pattern that emerged out of the material. And that's hard to do, but it's important. I hope that's what I've succeeded in doing in this volume. But it is, I have to tell you, quite honestly and being fair, that I may have imposed more structure on this than is in fact justified. I've tried very hard not to do that. As I say, I didn't come into it with presuppositions. I didn't assume things as much as possible. But it's certainly not impossible that that's there. And that's one of the things as you read you might be thinking about, well, is this really the way it was? Is this a fair judgment? Now, what does this all tell us? Well, in first place, it contradicts the image, the common image of Mr. Hoover as a reactionary, interested only in the welfare of the rich and hoping that some of the wealth will perhaps trickle down to ordinary people. That, I think, clearly was not what he was looking at. He was trying to look at a really national development which would benefit all Americans. That is, in that sense, he was a legatee of the progressive era. And I think was a progressive as much as a conservative. But he was conservative, clearly, in his conception of what the role of the government should be. So he brings together these two elements. And I really tried to avoid thinking about this progressive-conservative dichotomy, this whole division which is often brought up in talking about Hoover. I just didn't want to think in those terms because they don't seem to me appropriate. I think that one needs to get away from those kinds of categories, completely set them aside. And if you're really going to understand him, you have to understand him in his own terms. So that's really what I was trying to do. Obviously, when you stop and think about it, the final point is that he didn't entirely succeed. the structure he created, or helped to create in the 1920s, got into very serious troubles in the early 1930s. And we cannot deny the fact that something seriously went wrong. Well, what went wrong? Did he contribute to it? Was that a part of this? So this is where I touch the second part of my subtitle, imperfect. I think there were things that Mr. Hoover didn't get right. That there were things that he was wrong about. Now, sometimes those were things that he didn't know or couldn't have known. Economic analysis was a kind of a baby science at this point, if it's ever come to maturity. I think that's an open question. Anyway, but there were, when Hoover came to the Commerce Department, there were no accurate unemployment statistics, for example. Nobody collected them, or they were only guesses at very best. So when a great recession hit the country in 1921, there were just the most amazingly wild guesses as to how many people were unemployed or what percentage of the workforce was out of work. We still don't really know because nobody had those figures. That kind of lack of accurate statistics, accurate economic information, was a critical weakness in his planning for the future. And that wasn't his fault. He worked very hard, tried to get economists, worked closely with economists, knew a lot of them, recruited them, but the process was slow and not always a perfect one. So that's one weakness. Second, I think there is a weakness in Mr. Hoover's own approach. Although he was an engineer, and we incline to think of engineers as very meticulous and structured in their analysis of what is being done, and they use a lot of facts and figures. In fact, Mr. Hoover did not look at his own acts from the standpoint of an engineer. He liked to talk about them that way, but in practice, he looked at them in a much more ideological way as to whether they fitted in with what he thought the government should be doing, for example, rather than measuring whether they did it or not. And I won't talk a lot about that, but just one very quick example. The 1921 recession, Mr. Hoover organized a conference to deal with it, which decided on a program to go around the country encouraging businesses and municipalities to undertake a lot of activities to kind of help make work and assist people through the recession. The recession ended in 1922. Mr. Hoover announced triumphantly that the program had been a huge success. Well, it wasn't quite. And in fact, Commerce Department investigators who went out and actually looked at what was happening around the country discovered that in certain areas where unemployment was particularly bad, big industrial cities, for example, it hadn't worked at all. It hadn't made any difference. Unemployment was, at the end of the period, as bad or worse than it had been at the beginning. But by the time this had happened, those figures never, Mr. Hoover never looked at those figures and seemed uninterested in investigating whether this had actually worked in any orderly kind of way. Instead, he simply said, okay, good, job done, move on to the next, which was always his way. He was in a hurry, doing a lot of things, didn't have time always to reflect on these things as carefully as he might have. In this case, instinct, ideology, if you like, pushed him more than his training as an engineer. And that was something that was a surprise to me, but I concluded that this was not really, the engineering training was really not relevant to his work as a political leader. Nevertheless, and I won't go on with this, nevertheless, I came away with this still with an extraordinary admiration for the men who could come after being away from the country for 20 years, come home, see what was happening in the country, and say, this is what is going on. And that was right. He was right about that analysis. And then who could come up with a program for dealing with it, perpetuating it, and making it work stably over a period of time. It was an extraordinary thing. He was really, in that sense, a visionary, and I think deserves great credit for that kind of insight.